Delia Sharp was 18 and disowned. She had no family left to speak of, no prospects, just a worn leather satchel, a geologist's hammer from her father, and $92. And with that $92, she bought a worthless, played-out mining claim on the barren slope of Mount Davidson, a place rumored to be cursed. But what nobody knew was that buried beneath the collapsed timbers was a secret 2 centuries old. A secret that would challenge the most powerful men in Nevada. Settle in with us for her story, and let us know in the comments what part of the country you're watching from. Delia's life had been shaped by 2 things: the fine, sharp dust of the Comstock lode, and the quiet, steady love of her father, Thomas Sharp. He was not a miner, but a claims clerk, a man who lived in a world of paper and law, yet understood the mountain better than most men who gouged its depths. He saw the world not as dirt and rock, but as a ledger of geologic time, a story of pressure and heat written in strata of quartz, andesite, and diorite. He had come to Virginia City in the first rush, not with a pickaxe, but with a sharp mind and an honest hand, finding his fortune not in silver, but in the meticulous recording of the claims of others. He taught Delia everything. While other girls learned needlepoint and pie crusts, Delia learned to read a transit map, to distinguish fool's gold from chalcopyrite by its heft and brittleness, and to understand the precise, unforgiving language of the Mining Act of 1872. Her classroom was the dusty claims office, its long counters scarred with the ink of 1,000 frantic filings, its air thick with the scent of old paper and the faint, metallic tang of ore samples. Her father would unroll a brittle map, his finger tracing the neat squares that divided the mountain into a patchwork of hope and ruin. "The law, Delia," he would say, his voice low and patient, "is like a good timber. It must be sound, well-placed, and respected. Without it, everything collapses." His most treasured possession, and now hers, was a geologist's hammer, its steel head forged in Sheffield, its hickory handle worn to a silken smoothness from the constant pressure of his palm. It was a tool of inquiry, not destruction. He used it to read the rock, to tap gently at an outcrop and listen to its story. He taught her how to hold it, how the balance was everything, how to feel the vibration of the stone travel up the handle into her bones. 2 years ago, the mountain he had so diligently chronicled had finally claimed him, not in a sudden collapse or a fall, but with the slow, patient cruelty of the dust. Miner's lung, the doctor called it, though Thomas had never spent a day underground. The fine silica dust was everywhere in Virginia City. It settled on every surface, coated every throat, and over 17 years, it had turned his lungs to stone. After he was gone, Delia was sent to live with his only living relation, his younger brother Silas, a foreman for one of the smaller mining outfits. Silas was not a cruel man, but he was a pragmatic one, worn down by hard work and the constant anxiety of providing for his own wife and 3 daughters. Delia became a shadow in their cramped wooden house, another mouth at a table where there was seldom enough to go around. The transition from tolerated niece to unwelcome burden was a slow erosion of kindness. It began with small things: the thinnest slice of bread, the mending pile that was always hers, the quiet cessation of questions about her day. Her aunt, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched with worry, saw Delia not as her husband's kin, but as a rival for the already scarce attention of eligible bachelors for her own daughters. Delia was quiet, and she was pretty in a way that seemed to require no effort, a fact that her cousins resented with the fierce, unspoken competitiveness of young women in a town where a good marriage was the only available promotion. Delia took refuge in the skills her father had given her. She did the household accounts for her aunt with a speed and accuracy that was unsettling. She could tell by the sound of the ore wagons rumbling down C Street which mine they came from, judging by the rhythm of the wheels and the strain in the mule's traces. These small competencies, instead of endearing her, only served to mark her as different, an oddity. She did not complain. She did her chores, ate what she was given, and in the evenings she would take out her father's hammer. Not to use it, but just to hold it, the smooth wood a conduit to a time when she was not a burden, but a beloved child. The end came on a Tuesday, as most ordinary endings do. It arrived without shouting or tears, delivered with the quiet finality of a business transaction. Silas asked her to remain at the kitchen table after the meager supper had been cleared. His wife and daughters vanished into the other rooms, leaving a silence that felt heavy and deliberate. Silas cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a knot in the wooden tabletop. "Delia," he began, the word clumsy in his mouth. "Mr. Abernathy has made an inquiry." Delia felt a cold stillness spread through her chest. Mr. Abernathy was a merchant who owned the general store, a man of 50 with a sour disposition, damp hands, and a reputation for a temper that was as foul as the cheap cigars he chewed. He had buried 2 wives already. "He is a man of means," Silas continued, not looking at her. "He is prepared to make a formal offer of marriage. It would be a good match. It would secure your future." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, "and relieve us of you." Delia looked at her uncle's hands, calloused and stained from his work, hands that could break rock but trembled at this conversation. She thought of Mr. Abernathy's piggy eyes and wet cough. She thought of her father's belief in order and dignity. "I will not," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was as solid and unyielding as granite. Silas finally looked up, his expression a mixture of frustration and a strange, weary relief. He had done his duty, and she had refused. The consequences were now hers alone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small stack of bills held by a string. He slid them across the table. "This is what your father left," he said, his voice flat. "I've been holding it for you. $92. He pushed the paper after it. It was a formal, handwritten notice, informing her that she was to vacate the premises within 48 hours. It was an eviction. The cruelty of it was in its neatness, its administrative coldness. She was no longer family. She was a tenant in arrears. Delia looked from the money to her uncle's face and saw no malice, only the exhaustion of a man taking the path of least resistance. She did not beg or argue. She did not cry. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stood, took the money and the notice and went to the small attic room that had been her cage for 2 years. She packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, a change of underthings, her father's small collection of geology books, into her leather satchel. She wrapped the geologist's hammer in her spare shawl and placed it carefully on top. By dawn, before the family was awake, she was gone, the front door closing with a soft click behind her, the sound of a life being shut away. The walk from her uncle's house on the dusty periphery of Virginia City to the town's chaotic center was like a journey through the layers of her own life. She passed the schoolhouse she had attended, the small church where her father's funeral had been held, the rows of miners' cottages, all identical in their hopeful fragility. The air was already beginning to warm, carrying the scent of coal smoke from the hoisting works and the ever-present alkali dust. The city was waking up. Heavy ore wagons, drawn by long teams of sweating mules, rumbled down the graded streets, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding grooves into the hard-packed earth. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with the ceaseless subterranean thunder of the stamp mills, a deep, percussive heartbeat that was the pulse of the Comstock. Men in heavy boots and flannel shirts, their faces smudged with dirt, nodded to her, their expressions shifting from rote politeness to a flicker of curiosity. She was a young woman, alone, carrying a satchel at an hour when respectable women were at their hearths. She knew the whispers would begin soon. Silas would tell a version of the story that painted him as a benevolent guardian and her as a stubborn, ungrateful girl. In a town this small, a reputation could be shattered as easily as a pane of glass. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. She was Thomas Sharp's daughter, and she would not show them her fear. The landscape around her was a monument to brutal extraction. The slopes of Mount Davidson were stripped bare, denuded of the pinon and juniper that had once clung to them. In their place stood the great wooden headframes of the mines, the Gould and Curry, the Savage, the Hale and Norcross, and the colossal works of the Consolidated Virginia, a city of industry unto itself. They were like gallows, stark against the pale blue of the Nevada sky, their massive steam engines sighing plumes of white vapor. It was a place of immense wealth and immense desperation, and she was now adrift in it, a particle of dust in the great grinding machine. She found her way to the land office, a squat brick building on C Street that she had not entered since her father's death. The familiar scent of ink and old paper met her at the door, a painful echo of her childhood. She felt a pang of such profound loss that it almost buckled her knees. This place, once a sanctuary of learning and paternal love, was now just another institution where she was a stranger with a problem. She knew she could not afford to stay at one of the city's hotels. With the last of her resolve, she found a boarding house for women on a side street, a grim, narrow building run by a widow with a suspicious eye. She paid $2 for a week's rent on a cot in a shared room, the transaction leaving her with exactly $90. That night, lying in the dark, she listened to the coughing of the other women, the distant, unending pounding of the stamp mills, and the loud, frantic beating of her own heart. The $90, which had seemed a small fortune in her uncle's kitchen, now felt like a handful of dry leaves, ready to be blown away by the first gust of wind. She clutched the satchel containing her father's hammer, the one solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. She had to find a piece of ground, a place to stand that was her own. It was the only way. The next morning, she rose before the others, washed her face in a basin of cold water, and walked back to the land office, her purpose settling over her like a heavy cloak. The Virginia City Land and Claims Office was a study in organized chaos. Tall stacks of ledgers and survey maps leaned against the walls, threatening to collapse under their own weight. The air was stale, layered with the ghosts of 1,000 cigars and the acidic tang of spilled ink. Behind the long, polished counter stood Mr. Henderson, the chief clerk, a man whose shoulders were permanently stooped from a life spent bent over documents. He was a contemporary of her father's, and his face registered a flicker of recognition, then pity, as Delia approached. He knew Silas Sharp, and he could guess the shape of her predicament. "Miss Sharp," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "what can the office do for you?" Delia placed her hands on the counter to still their trembling. "I'd like to see the plat map of abandoned and forfeited claims, please." Henderson raised a skeptical eyebrow. Filing a claim required capital for timber, tools, and labor and he knew she had none. But he was a functionary, and this was a legitimate request. He heaved a massive cloth-bound book onto the counter and opened it. The page was a grid of squares and rectangles, a topographical map of the district overlaid with the boundaries of ownership. Many squares were filled with the bold, confident script of the big syndicates. Others, smaller and on the periphery, were marked with a faint F for forfeited or A for abandoned. "Most of these are played out," Henderson warned gently. "Or the geology's no good. A man could starve to death digging in the wrong place." Delia's finger traced the lines, moving away from the rich, crowded center of the lode, up the steep eastern slope of the mountain. Her father had taught her to look where others didn't, to read the negative space on a map. High up, near the summit, was a small, isolated square, colored a faded yellow, marked with a scribbled A. The entry in the ledger beside it was brief. Claim J17, the Jackrabbit, 5 acres. Last held by Miller, Evans, and Cobb. Forfeited due to non-payment of fees. Delia looked at Henderson. "This one. What's the story?" The clerk sighed, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "That one's bad luck, miss. Pure and simple. The 3 men who last worked it, Miller, Evans, and Cobb, died in a collapse last spring. Went in one morning and never came out. The company that owns the next parcel, the Ophir North, sent a man up to look. He said the ground is rotten, fractured diorite all the way down, unworkable. They sealed the entrance. A cursed claim next to a major mine." Delia's mind snagged on the detail. Her father had once told her how the big companies would sometimes use rumors of unstable ground or bad air to scare off prospectors from adjacent claims, driving the price down so they could acquire the land for a pittance. It was a common, if ruthless, tactic. "What is the price to file?" she asked, her voice steady. "The filing fee is $10, Henderson said, "and the back taxes and acquisition cost come to $70. $80 total." He looked at her, his expression making it clear he thought it was a fool's purchase. $80. It would leave her with only $10 in the world. $10 to buy food, tools, and shelter. It was a desperate gamble, a leap into an abyss. But it was a piece of the mountain. It would be hers. The alternative was to dwindle her money away on boarding house rent until she was destitute and forced to accept a proposal like Mr. Abernathy's, or worse. "I'll take it," she said. Henderson stared at her for a long moment, then seemed to find some memory of her father's stubborn resolve in her face. He nodded slowly, reached for a fresh deed form, and dipped his pen in the inkwell. Delia counted out the $80 in worn bills. She signed the papers, her signature, Delia M. Sharp, clear and firm. He took up his embosser, and with a heavy thud, the official seal of the Story County Recorder was pressed into the paper. He slid the document across the counter. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was an anchor. It granted her title to 5 acres of rock and sagebrush and a collapsed hole in the ground that had already killed 3 men. It was all she had. The climb to the Jackrabbit claim was harder than she'd anticipated. The road gave way to a mule track, which in turn dissolved into a faint trail winding through sagebrush and shattered rock. The air grew thin and cool, and the ceaseless noise of the city below faded to a distant metallic hum. By the time she reached the claim markers, 4 simple wooden posts driven into the ground, the sun was high and hot, beating down on the treeless slope. The mine was little more than a ragged wound gouged into the mountainside. The entrance, or what was left of it, was a chaotic jumble of splintered timbers, rock, and earth. It looked less like a collapse, and more like the mountain had violently vomited out its contents. A few pathetic remnants of the previous miner's efforts lay scattered about. A pickaxe with its head sheared off, a rusted shovel with a split handle, a length of frayed rope half buried in the scree. It was a scene of total failure, radiating a palpable aura of despair. Anyone else would have turned back. But Delia saw it through her father's eyes. She ignored the wreckage and studied the geology. She looked at the color of the rock, the angle of the strata, the way the sunlight glinted off tiny inclusions in the stone. The surrounding rock wasn't the fractured diorite Henderson had mentioned. It was a solid wall of granite, one of the most stable formations. The story didn't fit. She spent the rest of that first day not digging, but observing. Using her hands and the broken shovel, she began to clear the smaller debris from the face of the collapse, piling the rocks neatly to one side. It wasn't an attempt to open the mine. It was an investigation, an autopsy of a disaster. As she worked, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was work she understood. The rock did not judge her. The mountain did not care that she was a woman or that she was alone. It simply was. That evening, she found a shallow rock overhang a few hundred yards from the mine entrance that offered minimal shelter from the incessant wind. This would be her camp. She walked back down to the city before dusk, her muscles aching, and spent her last $10 with grim precision. She bought a new hickory handle for the broken shovel head, 20 feet of good hemp rope, a box of candles, a small sack of hardtack, and a slab of dried jerky. Her entire worldly fortune was now a piece of paper, a few tools, and enough food for 3 days. She had nothing left to lose. For the next 2 days, she worked with a slow, methodical rhythm that bordered on ritual. She rose with the sun, ate a piece of hardtack, and began her labor. The work was dangerous. She used the rope to lash herself to a sturdy outcrop above the entrance, allowing her to lean over the pit and pry at the keystones in the rockfall. She tested every remaining timber with a gentle push, listening for the groan of stressed wood. She used her father's hammer to break larger rocks into manageable pieces, the sharp clink of steel on stone the only sound besides the wind. She was not frantic or desperate. She was patient, her movements as economical and precise as a surgeon's. She was her father's daughter, applying his lessons in the harshest classroom imaginable. Late in the afternoon of the second day, she uncovered something that made her stop. It was a piece of a shattered support beam, a 12 by 12 of new pine. It wasn't rotted or crushed from the weight of the rock above. It was splintered outwards, the fibers of the wood peeled back as if from a powerful explosion. A few feet away, she found another, and then another. The evidence was clear. The collapse had been caused by a force from inside the tunnel, not a cave-in from the top. The miners hadn't been buried by a failing roof. They had been blown up. Someone had used too much black powder, or set a charge in the wrong place, and that meant they had found something worth blasting for. On the third day, the sun rose into a sky the color of faded denim. A persistent wind whipped down from the summit, carrying a high, lonely sound. After hours of careful work, dislodging one rock at a time, Delia finally cleared a space at the top of the rockfall, a dark gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. The air that seeped out was stale and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and still. She secured her rope, lit one of her precious candles, and dripped a small pool of wax onto a flat stone to serve as a holder. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the candle ahead of her and slid feet first into the darkness. The passage was tight, the rough rock scraping her shoulders. After a few feet, the space opened up. She was in. She stood, holding the candle aloft. The tunnel was short, barely 20 feet long, ending abruptly in the wall of rubble she had just breached. This was the Jackrabbit Mine. It was a pathetic, shallow hole, hardly worth the name. The bodies of the 3 miners were likely buried deep within the rockfall, but as her eyes adjusted to the flickering light, she saw it. To the left of the main collapse, so close to the wall that it was almost hidden in shadow, was another opening. It was different from the entrance she had just cleared. The rock around it was worn smooth, its edges rounded by time, not chiseled by modern steel tools. A different air seemed to flow from it, colder and drier. It wasn't on any map her father had ever shown her. This was something else entirely. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she moved toward it. The opening was a low arch, just tall enough for her to enter without stooping. She stepped through and was in another world. The walls here were not the fractured, seamed rock of the outer tunnel, but smooth, solid granite. The passage was narrow and perfectly straight, as if laid out with intention. It was utterly silent. The sound of the wind, the distant city, everything was gone, swallowed by the immense weight of the mountain. She walked for what felt like a long time, the tiny flame of her candle pushing back an ocean of absolute blackness. The tunnel began to slope gently downwards. After perhaps 50 yards, it opened into a small chamber, no larger than a pantry. It was a worked-out stope, the end of the line, and there, on the smooth, flat face of the far wall, she saw the carvings. At first, she thought they were petroglyphs, the work of the ancient peoples who had lived in these mountains. But as she brought the candle closer, she saw that it was script, letters, formal, cursive, and distinctly Spanish. Her father, a man obsessed with the provenance of things, had insisted she learn the old languages of the territory, Paiute, Spanish, the shorthand of surveyors. It was a skill she'd thought useless, another of his strange hobbies. Now, standing in the cold heart of the mountain, she blessed his memory. She traced the carved letters with her fingertips, the rock cold against her skin. The Spanish was archaic, but clear. Por la gracia de Dios y la corona de España, she whispered, the words sounding loud in the stillness. Esta veta de plata, la veta de la serpiente emplumada, es concedida a la familia de Montoya en el año de nuestro Señor 1694. By the grace of God and the crown of Spain, this vein of silver, the vein of the plumed serpent, is granted to the Montoya family in the year of our Lord 1694, a Spanish land grant, carved into the rock. It predated the United States. It predated Nevada. It predated the discovery of the Comstock lode by 165 years. Then her candle flame caught a different kind of reflection. To the right of the inscription, running in a thick, dark band through the granite wall, was the vein itself. It wasn't the milky quartz the American miners sought, which held silver and gold in scattered particles. This was a solid, almost black ribbon of horn silver, argentite, so rich it was practically pure. The previous miners had been following a worthless little quartz stringer. They must have broken through into this ancient Spanish tunnel by accident, seen the grant, and seen this vein. In their frantic, gold-fevered haste to blast it open, they had used too much powder, bringing the newer, unstable American tunnel down on top of themselves, sealing this place away once more. A sudden, chilling realization washed over her. The Ophir North, whose claim bordered hers, was one of the deepest and most aggressive operations on the mountain. Their tunnels ran for miles. They were almost certainly following this same massive vein from their own side. And this grant, this carving in the wall, placed the origin, the apex of the vein, squarely within the boundaries of her 5-acre jackrabbit claim. They weren't her neighbors. They were trespassers. Delia backed out of the Spanish tunnel, her mind racing. The knowledge she now possessed was as dangerous as it was valuable. The Ophir North Mining Company was a behemoth, a syndicate of San Francisco bankers and corrupt politicians. They could crush her. A lone girl with a fantastic story about a 200-year-old carving would be dismissed as a lunatic, or worse. They could have her committed, or arrange an accident on her claim. No one would ask any questions. She understood that her only weapon was the one her father had always trusted, the law, but to wield it, she needed unimpeachable proof and powerful allies. Her first priority was to document everything. She spent the rest of the day in the cold darkness, working by candlelight. She took out the small notebook and pencil she always carried in her satchel and made a detailed sketch of the Spanish inscription, copying every letter, every flourish, with painstaking accuracy. Then, she began to map the tunnel system. She used the length of her rope to measure distances, sketching the relationship of the main Jackrabbit Tunnel to the older Spanish passage, noting the downward angle and the precise location of the exposed vein. Finally, using the pointed end of her father's hammer, she carefully chipped away several small, heavy samples of the dark ore, wrapping them in a piece of her shawl. This was her evidence. This was the beginning of her rebuilding. Not the rebuilding of a collapsed mine, but the construction of a legal fortress. As dusk settled, she concealed the entrance to the mine as best she could, rolling rocks and brush over the opening she'd made. She could not risk anyone else stumbling upon her discovery. She walked back down the mountain, not to the boarding house, but towards the more respectable part of town where the lawyers and judges lived. She needed counsel, but not just any lawyer. Most of the attorneys in Virginia City were on the payroll of one mining company or another. She needed someone her father had trusted. A name surfaced from her memory: Judge Miller. A retired circuit court judge, now in his 70s, with a reputation for being fiercely independent, deeply knowledgeable in mining law, and openly contemptuous of the syndicate's greed. Her father had called him the last honest man in Story County. She found his house, a modest but well-kept stone building with a small garden. She knocked on the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The door was opened by the judge himself, a tall, stooped man with a shock of white hair and eyes as sharp and clear as ice. He looked at the dusty, determined young woman on his doorstep with an expression of weary curiosity. "I am Delia Sharp," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Thomas Sharp was my father." The judge's expression softened. "I remember Thomas. A good man, an honest clerk. Come in, child. You look like you've seen a ghost." She sat in his study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound law books. With as much composure as she could muster, she laid out her story. She placed the deed to the Jackrabbit claim on his polished desk, followed by her hand-drawn map, her precise sketch of the Spanish grant, and finally, the heavy, ore-laden pieces of her shawl. She spoke plainly and factually, just as her father had taught her to present a case. Judge Miller listened without interruption, his sharp eyes moving from her face to the evidence she presented. He picked up one of the ore samples, his practiced hand weighing it, his thumb rubbing its dark, greasy texture. He studied her sketch of the grant, his lips moving silently as he translated the Spanish. When she finished, a long silence filled the room. "The apex law," the judge said, more to himself than to her. "The rights to the entire vein belong to the owner of the claim where the lode's apex, its highest point, is exposed." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of something other than pity in his eyes. It was respect. "You say the Ophir North is working this same vein?" "I believe they are," Delia said. "It is the only major formation on that side of the mountain." The judge leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, Miss Sharp," he said, "it appears you have them by the throat." He stood up. "First, we need this ore assayed. I know a man, a Cornishman named Trelawney. He's honest and he doesn't like the Ophir board. Second, we need a lawyer. A young man, hungry and smart, not yet bought. I know him too. Elias Vance. This will make his career." The community was beginning to form, coalescing around her quiet resolve. The judge provided the wisdom and legitimacy. He was the first timber, sound, and well-placed. The rest would follow. The next morning, Judge Miller escorted Delia to the small, cluttered workshop of Mr. Trelawney, the assayer. He was a compact man with flowery white hair and hands permanently stained with the chemical evidence of his trade. He spoke in a soft, lyrical Cornish accent and moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who trusted process over pronouncements. He took Delia's ore samples without a word, placing one on a small anvil and striking it with a hammer. It didn't shatter like quartz. It flattened, a key characteristic of silver-rich ore. He grunted in approval, then proceeded with a fire assay, a meticulous process of crushing, melting, and chemical separation that Delia watched with rapt attention. The result, delivered 2 hours later, was staggering. The ore was over $3,000 a ton. It was bonanza grade, as rich as anything coming out of the core of the Comstock. Mr. Trelawney handed the certified report to Judge Miller, giving Delia a small, respectful nod. He was the second timber in her new structure. The proof. That afternoon, they met with Elias Vance. He was a young lawyer, barely 30, with a sharp suit and an even sharper mind. His ambition a palpable energy in Judge Miller's staid office. He listened to the story, his eyes alight with the sheer audacity of the case. A dispossessed orphan against the most powerful mining corporation in Nevada, armed with a 200-year-old Spanish carving. It was the stuff of legend. He peppered Delia with questions, testing the strength of her testimony, the accuracy of her maps, the details of her discovery. Her calm, precise answers impressed him. She was not a hysterical girl, she was a credible witness, and the daughter of a man the courts had respected. Elias Vance saw his chance to make a name for himself, to challenge the Goliaths of the Comstock. He agreed to take the case on contingency. He was the third timber. The weapon, armed with the deed, the assay report, and Delia's sworn affidavit, Elias Vance filed an injunction against the Ophir North Mining Company, demanding an immediate cessation of all work in their tunnels adjacent to the Jackrabbit claim. The company's superintendent, a florid, bull-necked man named Bannon, received the notice with a burst of incredulous laughter. The idea was preposterous. He threw the document in the trash. But the injunction was signed by Judge Miller, whose authority, even in retirement, carried immense weight. When court-martials arrived the next day to enforce the order, Bannon's laughter died in his throat. The hoisting works of the Ophir North fell silent for the first time in a decade. The legal battle that followed was a storm of paper and threats. Bannon's high-priced San Francisco lawyers descended on Virginia City, their strategy twofold: to intimidate Delia and to bury her claim in procedural motions. They offered her a buyout, $5,000 for the jackrabbit claim, a generous offer for a worthless piece of land. Delia, with Judge Miller and Elias Vance at her side in Vance's small office, refused without hesitation. Bannon then tried slander, spreading rumors that she was a fraud, a fantasist, or worse, a woman of loose morals trying to extort the company. But Delia refused to be drawn out. She stayed in a quiet room at Judge Miller's house, and her stoic dignity, combined with the judge's unimpeachable reputation, made the mud-slinging backfire. The turning point came when Elias Vance, in a brilliant legal maneuver, petitioned the court for an official survey of the Spanish grant. The company's lawyers fought it furiously, an act that screamed of guilt, but the petition was granted. A court-appointed survey team, accompanied by Elias, Delia, and the company's engineers, entered the Jackrabbit mine. In the flickering lantern light of the ancient Spanish stope, the surveyors took their measurements, their faces a mask of professional neutrality. Their report, filed a week later, was undeniable. The Montoya grant of 1694 was legitimate. The Veta de la Serpiente Emplumada apexed squarely within the boundaries of the Jackrabbit claim. And the Ophir North's most profitable tunnel, their primary source of revenue for the past year, had crossed the property line and was actively removing ore from Delia's land. The company was trapped. To challenge the legality of the Montoya grant based on its age would be to challenge the principle of first in time, first in right, the very foundation upon which every claim on the Comstock lode was built. They would undermine their own title. They had no choice but to negotiate. At the final meeting, Bannon sat across the table, his face the color of raw meat. Delia, flanked by her allies, made her demand. She did not want to sell. She did not want a one-time payment. She wanted a royalty. 10% of the gross value of all ore extracted from the Veta de la Serpiente Emplumada in perpetuity. Bannon choked. It was an unheard-of figure. But as he looked at the quiet, unmovable young woman before him, he knew he had lost. The papers were signed. Delia Sharp, the disowned orphan with $92, was now one of the wealthiest individuals in Nevada. The people in town, who had once looked at her with pity or suspicion, now nodded with a deep and profound respect. She was not just rich, she had won. She had beaten the mountain, and she had beaten the men who thought they owned it. A year later, Delia stood by the window of her own house, a small, sturdy stone cottage on a quiet street near the courthouse. It was not a mansion, but it was solid and warm, and it was hers. The evening was settling over Virginia City, and the lights were beginning to flicker on, amber squares of warmth against the deep blue of the desert twilight. The air was cool, and the scent of pinon smoke from her own hearth filled the room. On the simple wooden mantelpiece above the stove sat two objects. One was her father's geologist's hammer, its hickory handle polished to a dark sheen from the oil of her hands, its steel head clean and bright. Next to it rested a single heavy piece of horn silver from her claim, its dark, crystalline surface absorbing the firelight. They were the two poles of her life, the tool of knowledge her father had given her, and the fruit of that knowledge, wrested from the mountain's heart. She looked out at the sprawling, chaotic city, the sound of the stamp mills, a sound that had once been the soundtrack to her loneliness and fear, was now a comforting, rhythmic assurance of her own prosperity. She thought of her father, Thomas Sharp. He had never sought wealth, only understanding. He had believed in the quiet authority of facts, the integrity of the law, and the stories that the rocks told. He had not left her a fortune in dollars, but he had given her the tools to claim her own kingdom: a trained eye, a disciplined mind, and the courage to look where others had given up. He would have been proud. A quiet smile touched her lips as she thought of her Uncle Silas. News traveled fast in Virginia City. He and his family would know of her astonishing reversal of fortune. They would understand, with the bitter clarity of hindsight, the immense value of the young woman they had so carelessly cast out for the sake of convenience and a distasteful marriage proposal. There was no triumph in the thought, no thirst for revenge. There was only a quiet, settled sense of justice, as solid and real as the stone walls of her house. The mountain had held its secrets for centuries, waiting. It had held the legacy of the Montoya family, who had marked their claim with faith and courage, and it had held the bodies of the 3 miners who had died in their frantic greed. The mountain gave its gifts only to those who approached it with respect, patience, and understanding. Delia had listened, and it had answered. She reached out and picked up the hammer. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a tangible link to her father's hand, to his love. The steel was cool against her skin, but for the first time since his death, she felt a profound and unshakable warmth deep within her. She was no longer an orphan adrift in a hostile world. She was home. Her new life had taken on a rhythm as steady and dependable as the geology that supported it. The house, which she had bought and furnished with care, was no longer just a shelter, but a place of quiet contentment. Its silence was not the empty, resentful silence of her uncle's attic, but a peaceful quiet, filled with the soft ticking of a mantel clock and the whisper of the fire. The rumble of the ore wagons was a constant reminder of the royalty payments being deposited in her name at the bank, a river of wealth flowing down from the mountain. But the money was secondary to the community she had built. Judge Miller had become a grandfather to her, visiting twice a week to play chess and discuss the politics of the territory. His housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Mrs. Gable, was patiently teaching Delia the art of cooking, and her small kitchen was now often filled with the scent of baking bread. Elias Vance had become a trusted friend and advisor, their professional relationship blossoming into a warm camaraderie. They would walk together on weekends, not up the mountain, but through the sagebrush flats, discussing books and law and the future of Nevada. Mr. Trelawney, the quiet Cornish assayer, managed her investments with a prudence that bordered on artistry, ensuring her fortune would last. These people formed her new family, a family forged not by blood, but by mutual respect and shared struggle. They had seen her not as a helpless girl, but as a competent and determined woman, and they had stood with her. She had earned her place. She ran a hand over the smooth handle of her father's hammer. The $92 her uncle had given her had seemed like both a pittance and a king's ransom on that desperate morning. It had been the price of her freedom, a severance from a life that would have suffocated her. She had taken that pittance and invested it not in a sure thing, but in a cursed, abandoned hole in the ground, a place of death and failure. She had trusted her father's teachings over the fearful warnings of others. She had bought a pile of rocks and a whispered curse, and through patience and knowledge, she had found a hidden kingdom. Delia Sharp was 19 now, and she was home. She had arrived in Virginia City as a child, been cast out as a girl, and had now taken her place as a woman of substance and respect. She had $92 to her name when she walked out of her uncle's house, and she had spent 80 of it on a cursed patch of rock on the side of a barren mountain. It was the best $80 she ever spent. What forgotten piece of knowledge from your own family has proven to be the most valuable? Share your story with us in the comments. And if you found value in Delia's journey, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to see it.